Hello everyone, I'm Kibin Alleyne and today is Tuesday, April 2nd. You're now watching Open, a program that brings the Bronx and New York City straight to you. Don't forget to stay connected with us via social media at BronxNet TV. April is Autism Awareness Month, and to support autistic adults, the Autism Grief Project offers an online platform to help them cope with the complexities of grief and loss. This platform provides resources to navigate the challenges of losing a loved one as well as non-death losses. Advisory board member for the Autism and Grief Project and the Senior Vice President of Grief Programs at Hospice Foundation of America, Dr. Kenneth J. Doka, joins me to discuss the effort. Doctor, thank you so much for joining me.
Oh, thank you for having us. Thank you.
Now, the Autism and Grief Project launched in 2022. Can you tell me more about what sparked the inspiration to create this organization?
Sure. The basic reason was that there are a lot of resources for children on the autism spectrum about grief, but almost none, actually none that I'm aware of for adults. So the Hospice Foundation really, the Autism and Grief Project was launched in September of 2002 by the Hospice Foundation of America with a grant from the NLM Family Foundation. And what it tries to do really is it's a virtual toolkit. It's a one-of-a-kind platform with a mission to help adults with autism navigate and cope with the complexities of grief, and that arises from the loss of a person or a non-death loss. And we offer all kinds of resources to family, to the person with autism, to professionals. We offer firsthand accounts of grief, what we call social stories, videos, links to provide support. It's a real toolkit for people involved in loss and grief, and those trying to help persons with autism.
Now, I would love to explore, what are some ways that grief affects those with autism different from those who are considered neurotypical?
Okay. Well, I think you have to realize we're talking about two spectrums. Grief is a spectrum, and there's no single way that people respond to grief. Grief affects us on many, many levels: physically, emotionally, cognitively, spiritually, behaviorally. And then, of course, autism is a spectrum, where some people on the spectrum are very high functioning, and others might not even realize or recognize that they struggle with autism, to others who are nonverbal. So, so it's a wide project, and I think often people with autism may have difficulties expressing their behaviors and expressing their grief in particular ways. And so the project really tries to validate those different responses to grief and respond to people who are really struggling with grief. Others may see their responses as inappropriate, incongruent, or indifferent, and that might limit their support. For example, I once interviewed a young adult who had lost her father. She was very, very close to her dad. But whenever she was nervous, whenever she was grieving, she had this kind of nervous giggle. So she would, say, my dad died. And to other people, it just came off as very, very strange. But that was her way of expressing her nervousness.
I'm so glad that you pointed that out because it further just makes it known that everybody deals with grief differently. And so I appreciate you for pointing that out. How does your organization ensure that they support each individual based on their specific needs? And, what are some ways that we as a society can just be a little bit more aware of that?
Well, one is to go on our website. That might help, griefandautism.org. But I think, loss is really very much a part of life. And as I said, people respond differently. And what we try to do here is by offering a whole host of different resources, some verbal, some nonverbal, and we offer them. We have three tracks really in the program on the site. One is for people with autism, one is for their family members, and one is for professionals. And people can navigate through any of those three. So it really is a kind of valuable resource, and and really seeks to help people with autism understand, validate their own responses, but also helps those with it who are working with people with autism, whether as a family member or professional, to have a greater understanding.
Now, one of the organization's guiding principles is diversity and inclusion. How does your organization prioritize diversity?
Well, first of all, we understand that in grief in general, in hospice care, there has been a disparity where black and brown populations have not always made as much use of these facilities, may not be aware of them. And also because much of the early research was prioritized to support white children and with autism. And as a result, um, black and brown children have often been misdiagnosed or not diagnosed at all until they reach adulthood. And so there aren't as many services for them. But I think what we have really tried to do is to be inclusive as possible. There's been a tremendous effort in raising awareness about autism um, in in these communities and bridging gaps in resources. So we're really trying to make this more available to people um, and more open and more inclusive.
Now, can you talk a little bit more about the history of this? Because I think it's very interesting that, for, as you mentioned, for a very long time, a lot of Black and Latino or Black and Brown children were either misdiagnosed or just not diagnosed at all. You know, what effect did this have on the community of people who did have autism within these communities?
Yeah, and unfortunately, the effect was negative because they weren't getting the resources that they needed um, to maximize their ability to interact. So it was really important that I think a project really focused, that was open to diversity, that was open to inclusion, that was open to empowerment, and that would allow people with autism to get personal support, but also to help people who were dealing with them both professionally and in the family to also provide resources for them. I think it was an incredibly important project. I was very proud to be part of it.
Now, how can a lack of resources, and you know, I think for those who may not work in this community, they may not be aware of what those resources may look like. But how can a lack of resources affect those who live with autism, but also, you know, caregivers and friends and people who support those with autism?
Well, as I said, we're dealing with a spectrum. So I think the first thing we need to do is to understand that spectrum. And if there's not information out, if there's not information that's accessible, obviously that's going to complicate the situation some way. So again, what we tried to do was to really provide you might say, one-stop shopping, where people who have any relationship to the autism community, whether it's a professional caregiver, a clergy person, for example. Clergy can be critically important here in helping people identify and helping them find resources. People who would never think of going to a psychiatrist or a psychologist would be, maybe very, very open to just talking with their local priest or pastor or minister or rabbi or imam, whatever that person is. So again, we wanted to provide resources um, to all those involved in the community, to all those involved in care.
Now, I also want to take a moment to highlight this, which I was very happy to see. There's also an information portal dedicated to friends and family of autistic adults because I believe that it truly is a community effort. And, you know, the saying that it takes a village, I think this kind of like proves that, you know, correct. So can you talk a little bit more about the importance of having that feature?
Yeah, I think that's one of the most important features we have. Professionals often find information. As I said, there are services for people with autism, but it's really important to recognize that people with autism, like anybody else, all of us, are encased in communities, are encased in what I call intimate networks. And you want to get information out to those networks so those networks can really provide support. And so I think this I think is to me, one of my favorite features, is that it really does speak directly to three very distinct populations in ways that doesn't create silos, but creates the exchange of information across these three groups.
And I also want to highlight, which was also extremely important as well, that there was something there for caregivers, and
Yeah.
there was a focus on, self-care tips, which is so important. Can you talk a little bit more about, that addition to the website?
Yeah. As I said, we have three tracks on the website, but they're not exclusive. You can go between one and the other. One is professional caregivers, one is family caregivers, and one, of course, is persons with autism. And and of course, when you're dealing with someone with autism, it can add stress, especially if they're uh, on the lower end of the spectrum, so to speak, where they require much more care and much more support. And so it's important to talk about self care too. You know, um, I think we get a lesson whenever we go on a plane. We get a lesson on self care, and it's an important lesson. And the lesson is that when they're giving the opening announcement, they say, if oxygen comes out and you're sitting with a child, put your mask on first, and then help the child. And it really reminds us, unless we take good care of ourselves, it becomes much harder to care for other people. So we've got to learn from our airplane experiences to put the mask on ourselves and take care of ourselves if we're going to help others. And again, for caregivers, that's sometimes tough because we don't like to admit our own vulnerability.
Right. Now, I appreciate you for taking the time to explain this, and I think that the organization is doing amazing work. I know early in the interview you mentioned that you're so proud to be a part of this. Can you just talk a little bit more about your experience just being a part of this, this project and kind of helping this community?
Um, well, I think it's important to remember that I've been involved in the Hospice Foundation for probably over 30 years as a consultant and now as senior vice president and part of this project. And one of the things that I've really enjoyed about the Hospice Foundation is that it has really pioneered access to hospice by groups that are often um, not considered, and services to grieving people from those groups. So, a number of years ago, we did some extensive work, Hospice Foundation of America, in working with families with persons with intellectual disabilities. And it's part of a broad outreach that we've always had. We've always tried to be as inclusive as possible and to reach out to populations um, who may not be getting the best mainstream services, maybe because of class differences, ethnic differences, neurological differences. So, as an organization, we're pledged to inclusivity.
Well, Doctor, I want to thank you so much for joining us and, really sharing this very valuable information with our community. So thank you again.
Yeah, and again, anybody who wants to see the material, it's autismandgrief.org.
Thank
Thank you
you.
so much for inviting me.
Once again, to learn more about the work of the Autism and Grief Project, visit their website at autismandgrief.org. Don't go away, we'll be back with more Open after this.